The last thing Deb said before she left was that I never knew when to keep my mouth shut. She said it with her coat in her hand, not even looking at me, and she closed the door with that calculated care of someone who wants you to feel the effort she's making not to slam it. My mom stayed in the kitchen pretending she hadn't heard a thing. My dad stayed in his chair and turned the TV down 2 clicks, which was his way of saying things looked bad, but he wasn't going to get involved. Stood there for about 3 minutes, maybe more. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the wind hadn't, and you could hear it pushing against the living room window with that low, steady pressure that feels like breathing. I looked at the clock. 8:42 at night. Deb didn't have a car here. She'd come with us in the truck earlier, in the early afternoon, back when it still seemed like it was going to be a normal family visit. The walk back to the main road is almost 1.25 miles. By car, it's nothing. On foot, in the dark, with the frozen fields and the river running alongside, it's 1.25 miles where a person could very easily get hurt. I thought, she knows the way. She's been out here before. Then I thought, she came in the daytime. I grabbed my coat off the hook by the door, the scarf, the work gloves that still smelled like old leather. My mom appeared in the hallway and asked where I was going in that voice that already knew the answer and didn't like it. I told her I was going for a walk. She didn't say anything back, which was her way of saying I was wrong, but that she wasn't going to get involved either. Outside, the cold hit my face before I'd even finished pulling the door shut. It's not the kind of cold that just bothers you. It's the kind you feel deep in your throat when you breathe in hard. That air that seems more solid than air has any right to be. The flashlight I grabbed off the shelf by the entrance was the smallest one we had, one of those battery-powered ones with the rubber grip worn down, and the beam didn't reach far against the white of the field. It lit enough to keep from tripping, not enough to feel like you were actually seeing anything. The trail down to the river starts past the barn. During the day, it's easy to follow because you can see the willows along the bank and you just walk toward them. At night, the willows turn into a low, dark mass on the horizon, an outline that looks different depending on where you're standing, and you have to trust the ground under your feet to know you're going the right way. I'd made this walk hundreds of times. I knew where the ground dips a little near the second fence post, knew where the surface ice is thinner and makes a different sound when you step on it. I knew where I was going. Deb's tracks were there. I saw them just past the barn, boot prints in the packed snow heading in the right direction. That relieved me more than I expected. It meant she'd taken the normal path, that I'd find her soon, maybe even before the willows, and that we'd head back without any extra drama on top of what had already happened inside the house. I followed her tracks. The field was completely quiet except for the wind, which came in waves. Between gusts, the silence was the kind that feels like it takes up physical space, that you feel as pressure in your ears. My breath came out white in front of the flashlight and broke apart fast. I called her name every now and then, not loud enough to sound desperate, just loud enough for her to hear if she was close. Nobody answered. The tracks went all the way to the edge of the river. I stopped at the bank and looked at them. They went straight to where the snow met the ice at the shoreline, and there they stopped. The Clark Fork was partially frozen, but the middle of the river still ran, black and fast, with that low sound of water that can't stop moving. Swept the flashlight up and down both sides of the bank. No tracks going in another direction. No tracks coming back. I stood there long enough for the cold to start working through my coat. I called her name again, louder this time. The wind came before any answer could and took the sound with it. I was about to step up onto the bank to see if the tracks continued on the ice when I heard something on the other side of the willows. A shifting. Not the wind. The wind has a pattern. You learn to tell the difference after years in an open field. This was something else. The kind of sound a large animal makes when it shifts its weight from one foot to the other on hard-packed snow. I swung the flashlight in that direction. The willows were about 50 feet from where I stood, bare branches tangled together, and between them there was nothing the light could reach clearly. Just darkness and branches and the white of the snow on the ground. I went still and waited. For about 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then the sound came again, farther to the right, as if whatever it was had moved while I was standing there looking in the wrong place. And then it was gone, and the field went quiet like there had never been anything there at all. I thought, animal. probably an elk or a big deer that came down to the bank to drink. But I kept the flashlight aimed in that direction longer than I needed to if I really believed that. There's no logical explanation for why I didn't turn back right then. I was standing on the bank of the Clark Fork with tracks that stopped in the snow and no answer when I called Deb's name, and the sensible thing would have been to go back to the house, wake my dad, take the truck, and call the county sheriff. That's the protocol. I know what the protocol is because I grew up in a place where things go wrong in concrete ways. People get hurt, cattle go missing, equipment breaks down at the worst possible moment. And my dad always said the biggest mistake a man makes in an emergency is deciding he can fix it on his own faster than he can ask for help. I know that. I stood on the riverbank anyway. I think part of me was still expecting her to show up from somewhere obvious, from behind one of the willows or coming up the bank on the other side, and that I'd feel ridiculous for having considered anything worse. Deb was like that. She'd show up right when you were most worried about her, and look at you with that expression like she couldn't figure out why you were making that face. She'd done it before. We had enough history for me to know how she acted when she was angry, and when she was angry she needed space, air, movement. She walked. She always had. Only she walked during the day. I went along the bank to the right, slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the ice at the edge. The Clark Fork at that stretch is wide enough that you can't clearly see the other bank at night, especially with that low mist that the cold pulls up off moving water. The middle of the river caught a little of whatever light was left in the sky. Not much, just enough to tell you where the dark water was moving. I didn't want to look at it too long. The tracks didn't continue onto the ice. I crouched down and examined the bank up close with the flashlight, that low angle that makes marks show up better from the shadows they cast. Nothing. The snow at the edge was smooth, disturbed only by the wind. She hadn't gone into the river. That was what I needed to confirm, and I confirmed it. And I stood back up with a relief that lasted maybe 10 seconds before I realized it didn't solve the problem of where she'd gone. I called her name again. The mist from my own breath broke apart in front of the flashlight, and the wind carried the sound the wrong way. North, away from the path back to the farm. I waited. The river made that constant noise of water running too fast to fully freeze, a sound that during the day is almost pleasant, and at night has something insistent about it, like it's trying to cover up some other sound. That was when I heard the footsteps again. This time from the left, farther back behind the willows, near the spot where I'd been standing before. A clear shift in the hard-packed snow, heavy enough not to be a small animal. I swung the flashlight over and did the same thing as before. Stood still, waited, counted the seconds. The willow branches threw shadows that moved with the wind and made it impossible to tell what was real movement from what was just the illusion of it. The flashlight didn't help as much as I wanted. The beam was useful for maybe 25 feet. Then it turned into a diffuse glow that lit up the snow but didn't show anything with any definition. There was nothing I could make out. But the sound had been real. I know this field at night. I know the sounds it makes, and that wasn't wind or ice contracting in the cold or a dry branch snapping on its own. It was weight. It was something with mass moving carefully across a frozen surface. I stood there too long staring at the willows. When I turned back toward the path that led to the farm, it took me a second to find the right direction. An open field at night, especially with snow covering everything, has a sameness that tricks you. The reference points you use during the day, the different color of the grass, the contour of the ground, the relative position of the structures, all of it gets muffled or disappears. You depend more than you realize on subtle things. And when those things are gone, you notice how much you were using them without knowing it. I found the direction, started back. I'd walked maybe 40 yards when I stopped again. The footsteps were on my right side now, running parallel, about the same distance away as before, there behind the willows that lined the riverbank, that curtain of dark branches moving alongside me as I walked. I stopped and the footsteps stopped with me. I slowed down and the footsteps slowed down too. Not identical. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't my own footfall bouncing off some surface. It was something else walking at the same pace I was, adjusting when I adjusted. I stopped completely. On the other side of the willows, silence. My breath was coming in short bursts now. Those white clouds the flashlight lit up in front of me, and I realized my jaw was clenched in a way that was going to give me a headache later. I forced my shoulders down, tried to hear past the wind and the river. For a moment I thought there was nothing there. Then came a sound that wasn't a footstep. It was lower, more internal, like air being pushed out slowly through large nostrils. A breath that wasn't mine. I aimed the flashlight straight into the willows, the branches, the snow on the ground between them. Deeper darkness behind the first layer of trunks. And then, right at the edge of where the light reached, something moved back. It didn't run. It withdrew. With the calm of something that isn't afraid of you, that has simply decided it doesn't want to be seen yet. The flashlight beam trembled. I realized it was my hand. I went back to the farm. I can't quite describe what happened in the next 10 minutes because my mind was doing what it does when it receives information it doesn't want to process, right? It took what I'd seen, put it in a drawer smaller than it needed, and tried to force the drawer shut. Something large in the willows. Okay, Montana has large things. Bear, elk, mountain lion coming down from the slopes when winter squeezes the food supply. I've seen mountain lion twice in my life, once at less than 30 yards, and both times the animal ignored me completely and walked off with that indifference only apex predators have. This could be that. The problem with that explanation was the rhythm. Mountain lions don't adjust their pace when you adjust yours. No hunting animal tracks parallel over a long distance with that kind of consistent spacing. They close in or they pull back. They don't keep up. I came in through the back door and nearly walked into my mom, who was standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and that expression she kept for when she already knew something had gone wrong before you opened your mouth. I asked where my dad was. She said he'd gone to bed. I asked if Deb had called or texted anyone. My mom looked at me for a second and said no. I pulled off my gloves and stood in the entryway trying to decide what to do with the information I had. What I had concretely: tracks going to the riverbank, none coming back, and something large in the willows that had kept pace with me for at least 200 yards and pulled back when I lit it up. That was what I had. If I went and woke my dad and told him that, the first thing he'd ask was whether I was sure Deb's tracks didn't continue on the ice or the other bank, and I'd have to admit I hadn't examined the ice carefully enough, that I'd left too fast. I grabbed the bigger flashlight, the headlamp we used for nighttime work in the barn. I also grabbed the field knife that hung beside the door. It's not a large knife. It's a 4-inch Mora I use for cutting wire and dressing rabbit when I hunt in the fall. I put it in the side pocket of my coat without thinking much about it. My hands made the decision before I did. I woke my dad. He was up fast, the way a man who works land wakes up without that slow drift of someone who needs a moment to figure out where they are. I told him what I had in under 2 minutes. He listened without interrupting, got dressed while I talked, and the only thing he said when I finished was that he was going to get the shotgun. I said it was probably an animal. He said he knew, and went to get the shotgun anyway. We went out together. My dad is a man who makes less noise walking through a field than anyone I've ever seen, and I spent my whole childhood trying to copy it without ever getting close. He led the way to the barn, then stopped and listened to the field with that patience that only comes from 40 years of doing it. Wind, river in the distance, no sound that didn't belong. We followed the path to where I'd seen Deb's tracks. My dad crouched, examined the marks with the headlamp, traced the trail with his eyes to where it disappeared toward the river. He stayed quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he stood up and said we were going to the bank. We went. The tracks were still there, untouched, running to the edge and stopping. My dad examined the bank with a lot more care than I had. He tested the ice at the edge with his weight, swept the snow with the headlamp at a low angle, walked about 50 feet upstream and then 50 feet downstream. He came back to where I was standing and looked at the river for a while. He said he was going to call the county sheriff when we got back to the house. I asked about the willows, about what I'd heard and seen before. My dad looked at the curtain of bare branches along the bank and then looked at me with that expression that isn't quite doubt, It's a man weighing two possibilities at the same time. He said we'd take a look. We went to the edge of the Willows together. My dad's headlamp was strong, one of those LED ones that actually opens up the space around you. And when he put the light between the trunks, the scene was a lot clearer than it had been for me before. The snow between the trees was disturbed, not by the wind. When the wind disturbs snow, it leaves that even texture like combed sand. Here there were marks. Marks I couldn't name precisely, because they weren't hoof prints and they weren't paw prints in any way I recognized. But they clearly showed that something heavy had been standing there, and that something had two main points of contact, not four. My dad looked at those marks for a good while without saying anything. His silence bothered me more than anything he could have said. I was about to ask something when the wind shifted direction for a moment. That brief rotation that happens when a cold front pushes an air mass from a different angle. And the wind brought a smell with it. It wasn't deer. It wasn't bear, which I know, that rancid mix of fat and wet earth. It was something else. Warmer than the air around it had any reason to be. Closer, more shut in. Like wet animal and blood and something I had no reference point to name. It lasted less than 3 seconds before the wind shifted back. But my dad caught it too. I could tell by the way his shoulders went rigid before he lowered his voice and said, slowly and very carefully, that we ought to head back to the house right now. I didn't argue. We went back the same way we'd come. My dad walked in front with the shotgun and I followed behind, and neither of us said anything for a good while. The field looked the same. Low wind, hard snow, the sky that closed off gray that isn't full darkness but doesn't let you see a single star. My dad's headlamp opened a cone of white light in front of him, and I stayed inside that cone, with my own flashlight pointing out to the sides and a precaution I hadn't been aware of taking, until I noticed I'd been doing it for some time. The barn appeared on the low horizon ahead, 200 yards, maybe less. I was about to say something to my dad. I'm not sure what, something about calling the sheriff right away, about Deb, about the smell we'd caught, when he stopped suddenly and raised his left arm without turning around. That gesture I'd known since I was a kid. It meant stop, stay quiet, don't ask anything. I stopped. I listened. For about 15 seconds I heard nothing but the wind and my own heartbeat, which was louder than it should have been for someone who was just walking through a field he knew. Then it came. From the right, about 20 yards out, behind a low rise in the ground that in summer was where the grass grew tallest. A sound of movement, heavy, deliberate, like whatever it was had been walking slowly on purpose, in no hurry to get anywhere, just holding its position alongside us. My dad rotated slowly toward the sound and raised the shotgun. The sound stopped. The two of us stood in the open field, with the barn in front and the river behind, and the silence came back and filled everything with that solidity of a physical thing. My dad held the shotgun up longer than I expected. Then he lowered it slowly, without firing, and kept walking toward the barn without saying a word. I followed him. We came in through the back door and my dad went straight for the kitchen landline. The cell signal inside the house is bad, always has been, and dialed the county department. I stood in the hallway listening to him talk to whoever picked up. He gave Deb's name, described her, described what we'd found at the riverbank. His voice was completely steady, no extra urgency, the way a man from farm country talks when he wants to be taken seriously. He was told they'd send a car when they could, but that with the snow on the back roads it would take a while. My dad said he understood and hung up. He looked at me and said I should wait inside. I said I would. He went to the bedroom to get more layers and the backup flashlight. And I stayed in the kitchen for maybe 2 minutes before I went back out through the rear door. I know it was a stupid decision. I have no argument against that. What I can say is that staying inside while Deb was out there was not something my body was willing to do, regardless of what my head thought about it. I left without telling anyone, which was even more stupid, and headed back out across the field. My plan, if you can call it that, was to make a wide loop around the west side of the property, away from the Willows and the riverbank, and check the path that led to the main road. Deb had to be trying to reach the road. It was the only direction that made sense if she wanted to get away from the farm. I went along the side of the barn, circled around the empty corral, and stepped out into the open field to the west. The terrain here was different from the riverside. Flatter, without the low rises from the summer grazing pasture. No trees except for a cluster of 3 pines that stood near the fence at the property line. I could see them up ahead, dark against the gray of the sky, and I used them as a reference point. I walked about 70 yards without anything happening. Then the sound came from my left. It wasn't the same kind of sound as before, that careful shifting in the snow. It was sharper, faster, like something repositioning itself urgently for a second or two and then going still again. I swung the flashlight to the left and saw nothing. Just the flat field and the snow and the darkness beyond the reach of the light. I stood still. I waited. Nothing. I kept walking, but I drifted a little to the right without thinking about it. Just moving away from the side the sound had come from, on instinct, the way you step around a puddle without consciously deciding to. I walked another 30 yards and the sound came back. This time further ahead and to the left, cutting across the angle I'd need to turn to reach the west fence. I stopped again. The flashlight showed nothing. Open field, snow, darkness. But I was being redirected. I'd set out west and something was pushing my path to the right, consistently, every time I tried to correct course. Not by attacking, not by getting close enough for me to see it. Just by appearing at the right angle to make me prefer the other side. I did what anyone does when they realize this too late. I stopped, got my bearings, and tried to correct deliberately. I turned to face west, fixed on the 3 pines at the fence, and started walking straight toward them. The sound this time was different. It wasn't cautious. It wasn't lateral. It came from directly ahead, from the space between me and the pines, and it was loud enough that I felt it in my chest before I heard it with my ears. The impact of weight hitting snow, dry and final, like something much larger than me dropping from a small height and going completely still. I threw the flashlight forward. The beam reached all the way to the pines and showed nothing moving. But between me and the pines, the snow was different. Marks that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. I didn't go west that night. I went back inside through the same rear door, and my dad was in the kitchen with his coat still over his arm, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to relief mixed with something he wasn't going to name in front of me. He didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't explain. We spent some time in the kitchen without talking, him standing by the stove and me pulling off my boots. And the silence between us had that specific texture of 2 men who've seen similar things and are deciding together, without discussing it, that they're not going to talk about them yet. My mom appeared in the hallway with the look of someone who hadn't slept a single minute. My dad said the police were on their way and that there was nothing we could do outside in the dark that couldn't wait. He said it in that tone that doesn't leave room for argument, not because he was giving orders, but because it was true and all 3 of us knew it. My mom went back to the bedroom. My dad went to make coffee. I sat down in the kitchen chair and stared at the table. What I knew up to that point, broken into pieces. Deb had left on foot, had taken the path to the river, had made it to the bank, and after that, no tracks of hers came back. On the Willows side, there was something large enough to make consistent noise in the snow, with 2 main points of contact, and carrying a smell that my dad had caught along with me, and that had made him cut any further investigation short. And on the west side, when I tried to cut around the outside, it had gotten ahead of me. It had reached the angle I needed to turn before I did, and stayed there until I backed off. That was the detail I kept coming back to. It wasn't pursuit. Pursuit would look different. It would be closing in, direct pressure, the kind of thing a predator does when it wants to reach prey. This was something else. It was keeping me inside a space. Every time I tried to leave in one direction, it appeared in that direction. It didn't attack. It just stood there, heavy and still, until I chose the other way. I kept thinking about why. The answer that came to me, and that I didn't like, was that it knew what it was doing. Not the way a person knows, not planning, not strategy with steps and objectives. More like what a hunting animal knows in its body. That kind of intelligence that doesn't need thought, because it's sewn into muscle and instinct. It was hurting me. Every push on the right flank, every sound at the angle that made me prefer the other side. was part of a behavior that thing probably didn't even know it was running. The coffee finished and my dad set a cup in front of me without asking. I asked him carefully whether he'd seen the marks on the west side. He was quiet for a second before saying he hadn't gone out west. He said it without looking at me, stirring his coffee slowly. Then he said, still without looking at me, that the marks on the Willows side weren't from any animal he knew. I stayed quiet. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the sink, and said he was going to wait for the police outside. He picked up the shotgun from the back of the chair and went out the front door. I should have stayed inside. Instead, I grabbed my coat, pulled my boots back on, and went to the side window in the kitchen, the one that faced the north field, the side between the farm and the river, the Willow side. From that window, I could see about 40 yards of field before the darkness swallowed everything. For a while, there was nothing out there, but the field and the low wind and the reflection of snow under the closed-off sky. I was starting to think I should go find my dad when something moved at the edge of what the window light reached. At the limit of visibility, that point where the light from the house still arrived but couldn't resolve anything clearly. It was tall. That was my first thought, concrete and simple. It was tall. It stood upright, with that unmistakable verticality of something that stands on its hind legs, and the proportions were wrong for any animal I had a reference for seeing that way. Very wide at the shoulders. The arms too long, hanging in a way that broke the silhouette in a way I kept trying to reinterpret, even as I was looking at it. The head was large, tilted slightly downward, turned in the direction of the window. In my direction. I stood there without breathing. It stood there too. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me on the inside of the glass and it on the outside at the edge of the light. But it was long enough for me to understand I wasn't being observed by accident. It wasn't an animal that had noticed me by some coincidence of angle and scent. It was something that had come there with a purpose I couldn't name. And it was standing at that exact spot, no closer, no farther, with a deliberateness that chilled me in a way Montana cold hadn't managed to do the whole night. Then my dad shouted my name from outside. It wasn't a panicked shout. It was that short, controlled kind that means get over here right now. I flicked my eyes toward the door for less than a second. Just the reflex of someone hearing their name called. And when I looked back at the window, it was gone. The field was empty. I went out the back door and over to where my dad was standing, on the north side, and he was pointing his flashlight at the snow in the field. There were tracks leading from the direction of the Willows, coming in a relatively straight line toward the kitchen window, stopping about 20 feet from the wall of the house and going back. 2-point marks, spaced in a way that indicated a long stride, large frame, real weight on hard-packed snow. My dad stood looking at the marks without saying anything. Then he looked at me. He asked if I'd seen something through the window. I said yes. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you'd already calculated, and stood there for a while in silence with the shotgun in his hand and the flashlight pointed at the ground. When he spoke, it was low, almost to himself. He said the police weren't going to get there in time to do anything useful that night. The county cruiser arrived 40 minutes later, at the speed of people who'd driven a bad road in the dark and hadn't been in any hurry to get there. 2 officers, an older one and one who looked to be in his mid-20s, and spent most of the time staring at the field with the expression of someone who grew up in a city and doesn't quite know what to do with that much dark space in front of him. The older one was a lean, spare-talking man who listened to my dad carefully and asked practical questions about Deb, how long ago she'd left, what she was wearing, whether she had a history of hurting herself, whether she'd been drinking. My dad answered everything with the same economy of words. We went to the riverbank with the officers' flashlights, which were better than ours. The older one examined the tracks, examined the bank, tested the ice with his foot. He said he'd get the search team out before dawn, that with the snow stopped, the trail would still be usable in the morning. He said Deb had probably found somewhere to take shelter, some nearby barn or outbuilding, and that it happened more than people realized. He said nothing about the marks by the Willows. My dad didn't mention them either. I looked at my dad and he gave me a look back that meant, not now, not in front of them. I understood. Anything we said about what we'd seen was going to come out in a way that didn't help Deb, and wasn't going to make those two officers do anything different from what they already had planned. The search team was coming in the morning. The night was going to keep being what it was. The officers left a little after midnight. My dad said we'd sleep in shifts, that he'd take the first watch and wake me in 3 hours. I went to my room and lay down with my coat still on and my boots on the floor beside the bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing I wasn't going to sleep and getting annoyed about it. My bedroom window faced east, away from the north field, but I still lay there listening to the wind with an attention that doesn't let you rest. Every gust that hit the wall made me hold my breath for half a second before letting it go. I heard nothing. I slept. Nothing. When my dad came to get me, I was already up. I took the shotgun while he went to the bedroom, sat down in the kitchen chair with it across my lap, and listened to the farm breathe in the cold. 2 hours like that, nothing happening. The wind started dying down around 3 in the morning, and the silence that was left was heavier than what had been there before. That kind of stillness you feel on your skin like pressure. At 3:40, I couldn't sit still any longer. I went out the back door with the shotgun and the headlamp, went to the barn first slowly, listening with every step. Nothing. Went to the corral. Nothing. Went to the edge of the north field where the marks my dad had lit up were still pressed into the snow. The headlamp made them deep and sharp, each depression casting a small shadow. I stood there looking at them for a while. I followed the trail. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It was the kind of thing a body does when the mind is too tired to veto it. The marks went from the Willows toward the kitchen window and back as I knew, but before they turned back, they made a wide arc across the open field, and that arc headed toward the east side of the property, near the old fence we'd never fixed right, because the cattle never reached that far. I followed the arc. The fence appeared in the headlamp beam after about 100 yards. 4 strands of barbed wire, the wooden posts tilted under the weight of years of accumulated snow, a chain-link gate in the middle that was locked with the same rusted padlock as always. That was where I saw the jacket, on the ground near the gate. It wasn't whole. It was the upper portion, the right side, scratched and torn in a way that wasn't wear or barbed wire snagging. It was force. The fabric had given from the inside out at 3 parallel points, spaced in a way I recognized without wanting to. The color was dark gray with an orange detail on the sleeve. I knew that jacket. I had seen that jacket that afternoon, inside the house, when Deb took it off the hook before she walked out. I stood there looking at it for longer than I should have. The cold crept in through my collar while I stood there, and I didn't even notice until the back of my neck was numb. I crouched down and picked up the piece of jacket with my gloved hand. It was light. No visible blood, but the snow underneath it was packed down in a way that suggested weight and movement, not a fall. I folded the fabric slowly and put it in my coat pocket without quite knowing why, as if keeping it would make some kind of difference. I stood up and looked out at the field on the other side of the fence. The property ended there. Beyond it was acres of open pasture belonging to another farm, abandoned for years, no structures that I knew of. The field stretched out until it became complete darkness beyond the reach of the headlamp, flat and white and silent. There were no tracks from Deb on the other side of the fence. There were other tracks, the same ones as before, those 2 contact points with the long stride, heading east in a straight line until they disappeared into the dark, leaving the property, going somewhere I didn't know well enough to follow in the dark. I stood at the fence for a while, with the weak wind hitting my face. The feeling that came over me wasn't the kind you can put a name to right away. It was a mixture of things without individual names. The presence of the piece of jacket in my pocket, the empty field on the other side, the night that still had hours of darkness ahead, and the slow and very bad understanding that the search team was going to arrive in the morning and would probably be looking in the wrong direction. I went back to the farm, but I already knew, as I walked, that before sunrise I'd be back at that fence. I went back at 4:20. I know the time because I looked at the kitchen clock before I left, with that strange awareness of someone recording details without knowing why, as if the time was going to matter later. My dad was asleep. I should have woken him. I didn't. I went through the rusted fence gate carefully to keep the chain from making noise. ducked under the barbed wire at the spot where the sunken post left enough clearance, and stepped into the field on the other side with the shotgun in my right hand and the headlamp trained on the marks in the ground. The cold had hardened further since midnight, that pre-dawn phase before dawn, when the temperature drops its last step before it starts to climb, and the snow was so compressed my boot barely left a mark. The creature's tracks were still sharp because they were deep, very deep. Whatever weight was making those marks was real weight, concentrated over a small area, and each depression had that defined edge that only appears when something very heavy lands with precision. I followed the trail east. The abandoned field was different from ours. The summer grass, uncut for years, had died in tall clumps that the snow covered halfway, creating an uneven surface the headlamp turned into deceptive shadows. Every 10 yards I saw something that looked like movement and wasn't. I learned fast to ignore the shadows from the clumps and focus on the ground, on the trail, on the direction. About 150 yards past the fence, the trail changed. It was no longer moving in a straight line. It had started making wide curves, the kind of path that has no clear destination, that looks more like territory sweeping than purposeful movement. At one point, the trail circled in a wide loop around a low spot in the ground, where water probably pooled in summer. At another point, the marks approached a cluster of dry brush and went still there for a while. I could tell because the depressions were deeper there, overlapping, the weight having settled and resettled in the same spot while whatever it was stood there, waiting for something, or watching. I kept following. The headlamp was starting to lose intensity. I hadn't changed the batteries and was cursing myself for it silently when I stopped walking because the trail stopped. It simply stopped, in the middle of open field, with no structure or obstacle nearby to explain it. The last few marks were deep and close together, as if it had slowed its pace, and then nothing. The snow in every direction around them was undisturbed. I stood there looking at the ground for a while, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard the breathing. It was behind me and above me at the same time, which didn't make sense until I turned around and understood that it was close, much closer than any sound that night had been. 4 or 5 yards away, at most. The headlamp hit it dead on. I'm not sure how long I looked at it before my nervous system decided what to do. It might have been 2 seconds. It might have been more. What I know is that what I saw got pressed in a way that doesn't come undone. The kind that has you waking up weeks later in the middle of the night already seeing it without having to remember. It was tall. Taller than I'd estimated from the window. Close to 8 feet, maybe more, with that quality that real size has of confounding your expectations, even when you were already bracing for something large. The shoulders were too wide, the muscle mass of the torso dense beneath a dark, thick coat of fur that the headlamp made almost black, without shine, like material that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The arms hung too long, ending in hands. I can't call them anything else. They were hands with that articulation and that finger length that didn't belong to any animal I knew, held slightly open at hip level. The head was turned toward me. The muzzle was wide and flat, with large nostrils that opened and closed in that slow rhythm of something that's smelling with attention. I only caught the eyes as a flashlight reflection for a second. No special glow, no unnatural color. Just the ordinary reflection an animal's eye makes when the light hits at the right angle, like a cat or a deer. Then it moved its head slightly to the side, and the reflection disappeared, and there were just dark eyes and a dark face. It wasn't growling. It wasn't making any sound except that heavy, steady breathing. It was just standing there looking at me. I raised the shotgun slowly. It didn't back away. It didn't attack. It stood there with the stillness of something that either doesn't recognize what you're holding as a threat or simply doesn't care. And it was that detail, the complete indifference to the raised shotgun, that convinced me that my strategy of following the trail and finding the creature in the open field had been the worst idea I'd had all night. I fired into the air, not at it, to the side, upward, with the intent to scare, to create distance, to buy time for whatever came next. The blast was enormous in the silence of the open field. It echoed in a strange way in the dry cold, and it took one step back. Not a run, not a startle, a careful withdrawal, like something reassessing the situation. I turned and ran. I ran in a way I hadn't run in years, that kind of running where the body takes over and the mind goes along with nothing to add. The headlamp bounced against my forehead, and the uneven field threw light at useless angles, and I tripped on the clumps of dead grass without falling through sheer momentum. I could hear my own breath exploding in the cold. I didn't hear footsteps behind me. I don't know whether it was coming or not. I didn't look back. The fence appeared ahead sooner than I expected. I went through the same gap at the sunken post without stopping, tore my sleeve on the wire without feeling it, crossed the farm's field in a straight line, and hit the back door hard enough to wake the whole house. My dad was in the kitchen in 10 seconds with the shotgun in his hand, and the face of someone who already knew, before he saw me, that the shot he'd heard had been mine. He looked at me standing in the doorway, gasping, with my sleeve torn and the headlamp still blinking on my forehead. He asked if I was hurt. I said no. He asked what I had seen. I spent a while trying to find the right words and couldn't find any that fit. So I described the size, described the arms, described the indifference to the raised shotgun. My dad was silent for a time that felt long to me. Then he went to the sink, turned on the cold tap, and held his hands under the water for a few seconds without explaining why. When he turned around, his expression had changed in a way I had never seen before on his face. In 40 years of being that man's son, it wasn't exactly fear. It was the face of someone who had just ruled out the last reasonable explanation he had. My dad did something I didn't expect. He went to the bedroom, stayed there for about 2 minutes, and came back with a folded topographic map he kept in a cardboard box under the bed along with the farm's paperwork. It was an old map, one of those printed by the Geological Survey, with the contour lines marked in brown and the waterways in faded blue. He spread it out on the kitchen table and studied the eastern part of the property, the abandoned field, the smaller tributaries of the Clark Fork that cut through that area diagonally. I asked what he was looking for. He said he was trying to understand where it might be coming from, not as a philosophical question, as a practical question from a man who needs to know where the problem enters in order to think about how to deal with it. He ran his finger along the map, following a tributary that started in the slopes to the north and ran down toward the abandoned field. He said the dense vegetation along that tributary was the kind of place a large animal could move through without being seen. That if the creature used that corridor, it came and went through there. I stood looking at the map with him. There was a structure marked in the abandoned field about 400 yards from our fence. A small symbol indicating a building, probably what was left of the old farmhouse, walls and a roof, or just walls, impossible to tell from the map. Near that symbol, the tributary curved and widened into what looked like a natural pond or wetland area, the kind of place that in winter would freeze over on top but hold moisture underneath, attracting animals that knew where to find water without having to break through thick ice. I didn't say anything. My dad didn't either. But we were both looking at the same point on the map. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He said the search team would arrive at first light, and that until then we were staying inside. He said it looking at me in a way that was less an order and more a warning, the kind you give when you already know the person has considered doing the opposite, and you want to make clear you're aware of it. I stayed inside for about 40 minutes. What got me back out wasn't courage or stubbornness. It was a sound unlike anything I'd heard that night, coming from the north side of the farm, from the field between the house and the Willows. A sound that took me about 3 seconds to identify, and that when I did had me up out of the chair before I'd thought about it. It was a human voice, not words. At least I couldn't make out words. It was the tone, that frequency the human ear recognizes in another human even through wind and walls and distance. High-pitched, intermittent, the kind of sound a person makes when they're exhausted or cold or hurt and don't have enough energy left to scream properly. I went out the back door calling Deb's name. The north field was silent when I stepped outside. The wind had stopped entirely. That kind of stillness that comes before dawn, when the air goes motionless as if it's holding its breath. The headlamp was completely dead now, batteries gone, and I'd gone out with just the small handheld flashlight that had been in my coat pocket since the beginning of the night. The beam was weak, but it was what I had. I moved into the north field, calling her name every 10 yards. Nothing answered. I kept going. I passed the spot where the creature's tracks came and went, where the snow was churned up. I headed toward the willows. The voice, if it had been a voice, if I hadn't just heard what I wanted to hear in a moment of sleep deprivation and exhaustion, didn't come again. I went into the willows. Inside them, the field of vision closed in fast. The bare branches created a mesh the flashlight couldn't cut through cleanly, throwing shadows that layered over each other and made it hard to judge distance and depth. The ground between the trees was disturbed in several places, old and new marks mixed together, that area that had clearly been used as a corridor more than once. The smell from before was back, fainter, mixed with the smell of frozen earth and old wood. I'd gone about 30 yards into the willows when I heard the branch snap. Above me, I raised the flashlight. The canopy of the willows wasn't dense enough to support real weight on the upper branches. I knew that. Those branches were thin and dry in winter, but the sound had been real, sharp, unmistakable. I looked up and the flashlight showed branches and darkness and snow falling from a disturbed point about 12 feet above my head. I turned to get out of the willows. It was at the entrance. I hadn't heard it approach. I hadn't heard any movement at all. It was simply there, standing between two of the larger trunks, blocking the most direct angle of exit with that same stillness as before. That quality of something that doesn't need to move to take up space. The darkness between the trees made it less distinct than it had been in the open field, but the size was unmistakable. The height, the width of the shoulders, the long arms. The small flashlight flickered once, flickered again, then went out. I stood in complete darkness inside the willows with the shotgun in my hand and its breathing reaching me. That warm, heavy air that had no business existing in that temperature. And I understood with a clarity that darkness sometimes produces that I had walked into exactly the wrong place, in exactly the way it wanted me to walk in. The sound it made then wasn't a growl. It was lower, more internal, produced deep in the chest, that vibration you feel in your sternum before you process it through your ears. I raised the shotgun in the dark, aiming at the sound, and my finger went to the trigger, and I realized that if I fired now, blind and missed, I wasn't going to have time to reload. I stood still. It stood still. Between us, only the dark and that damp heat that kept arriving in slow waves. There's a point beyond fear where the body stops producing useful responses. It's not calm. There's nothing calm about it. It's more like when a circuit overloads and shuts down. You're still present, still registering everything with an absurd sharpness, but the normal physical responses simply stop arriving. Your legs stop shaking. Your breathing goes shallow and steady without you telling it to. Your fingers on the shotgun go quiet. It's the kind of state that probably has a technical name in some medical manual, and that I only knew from experience in that moment. In the complete dark inside the willows, with that damp heat arriving in waves from the direction where the creature stood. I didn't fire. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was the same thing as before. The body taking over when the mind is spent, only this time the body chose to go absolutely still instead of running. Maybe because there was nowhere to run. Maybe because some very primitive part of me understood that movement was what it was waiting for. I stood with the shotgun raised in the dark, aimed at the sound of the breathing. The breathing didn't advance. We stayed like that for a stretch of time I can't measure. The cold was intense inside the willows without the body's movement to fight it, and I started to feel it coming in through my wrists, my neck, the gap between my coat and my boots. Snow fell in a fine powder from some disturbed branch above me every now and then, and that sound, with that faint whisper of dry snow dropping, was the only sound besides its breathing and mine. Then it moved. Not toward me, laterally. One step to the right, slow, with that weight I already knew from the sound in the snow, and then another, and I rotated with it in the dark, trying to keep the shotgun aimed at the sound without being able to see anything. It was moving around me, going in a wide arc around where I was standing, too slow to be flight and too steady to be hesitation. It was deliberate movement, the kind I had learned to recognize that night. When it passed on my right side, I felt it more than heard it. The heat came first. That wave of warmth that had no business being there, damp and dense. Then the smell, concentrated and close. The one I'd first caught in the Willows with my dad, and that was now less than 6 feet away. Maybe less. I heard the breathing change pitch for a second. That variation large nostrils make when something catches their attention. And I went completely rigid with my finger on the trigger and my eyes open in the dark with nothing to see. It passed. Kept going in its arc, moved completely around my position, and I heard the footsteps heading away through the willow entrance, that same side where it had been standing and blocking me. Leaving. Going off with that same unhurried deliberateness with which it had done everything that night. In 20 seconds, the breathing was gone. I stayed in the same spot for longer than I probably needed to, waiting for the sound to come back, waiting for the warmth to come back, waiting for anything. Nothing came back. The cold of the Willows went back to being just the normal cold of Montana in the middle of the night, without that layered temperature its presence had produced. And that return to normal was somehow more unsettling than the presence itself. I moved slowly toward the exit. Each step I tested the ground before putting my weight down, waiting for any sound that would tell me it was still close. Nothing. I came out of the Willows and the open field spread out in front of me with the gray sky beginning to lighten on the eastern horizon. Not sunrise yet, just that pre-gray that comes an hour before it. Enough to make out the outline of the field without a flashlight. Enough to see what was on the ground about 50 feet from the Willows. I walked toward it slowly. It was a boot. One boot lying on its side in the snow as if it had been placed there, not thrown. I recognized the sole immediately. The same tread I'd been following since the barn, since the very beginning of that night. Around the boot, the snow was disturbed in a way that wasn't passage. It was presence. Something or someone had been standing there long enough to compress the snow in layers, and the marks around it were a mixture of two types I knew very well by now. I crouched down and looked at the marks with eyes the gray of the sky was beginning to help. The boot was pointed toward the river, not toward the farm, not toward the main road. Toward the Clark Fork, which was about 200 yards to the north. Invisible from here, but audible now that the wind had stopped entirely. That constant murmur of water running under partial ice. I picked up the boot. It was cold, but not completely stiff, which told me nothing useful about how long it had been there. It had that specific weight of something worn by a real person. The interior shaped to the form of a foot. The lace untied and partially pulled out as if it had been removed in a hurry or with difficulty. I knelt in the snow with the boot in my gloved hand and the sky beginning to lighten above me. And what I felt wasn't crying or despair, or any of the reactions I would have predicted for that moment. It was a kind of exhaustion so complete it had come around the other side. That state where you stop resisting reality, not because you've accepted it, but because you don't have the energy left to keep up the resistance. The boot, the piece of jacket in my pocket, the tracks stopping at the riverbank, and the creature that all night hadn't wanted me near the river, that had pushed me away from the bank, that had herded me across the field, that had kept me inside a space I only began to understand when I knelt there in the empty field with the gray sky growing above me. It had kept me away from the river, not away from the house, away from the river. I stood slowly with the boot in my hand and looked toward the Clark Fork in the dark, and the sound of the water reached me with that insistence of something that doesn't stop, that hadn't waited for any part of that night, that had kept doing what it does while everything else happened around it. I started walking toward the river. The field between the Willows and the bank of the Clark Fork is flat and short, less than 200 yards, and during the day you cover it without thinking. That morning that wasn't yet morning I took too long, stopping every 10 steps to listen, to sweep the field with my eyes in the growing gray of the sky, to check that the shotgun was still in the right place on my arm. There was no sound except the water, no movement in the Willows. The field was empty in the kind of way you can confirm, not the kind that hides things. The creature had gone. I can't explain how I knew it with the certainty I felt, but I knew. There's a difference between a field silence when there's nothing there and a field silence when something is hiding in it, and that difference has no precise name. It's something that comes in through the senses without passing through language. That silence was clean. The field had given itself back. I reached the bank of the Clark Fork with the sky the color of old lead above me, and the river in front of me. The dark water ran through the center where the ice hadn't closed. That fast and constant movement the Clark Fork has in that stretch because of the rocks on the bottom that break the current in different directions. The banks were frozen in a thin, translucent layer, with the snow on top forming that flat white surface that from a distance looked solid and up close showed the cracks where the ice gave way to the weight of the water pooled underneath. She was sitting on the opposite bank. Not across the river, across a notch in the bank at a point where the edge curved inward into the neighboring property, forming a kind of shallow inlet that got waterlogged in summer. I wouldn't have seen her from there if I hadn't arrived at exactly that angle, if the sky hadn't lightened exactly enough at that moment. She was sitting with her back against a fallen willow trunk, legs bent in front of her, arms wrapped around her knees, wearing only one jacket. The jacket I had in pieces in my pocket wasn't on her. I called her name. She didn't respond right away. She raised her head slowly, the kind of slowly that belongs to someone who had been asleep or close to it, and looked in my direction for a second before lowering it again. Alive. Awake enough to respond to sound. I found the narrowest crossing point about 30 yards upstream, where the bank ice was wider, and the rocks in the riverbed created a path with shallow water in the gaps between them. I crossed, stepping carefully, feeling the ice complain under my weight but not give, wetting my boots to the ankle in the middle stretch where there wasn't enough rock, and the cold water came straight through the leather. I got to her. Up close, her condition was clearer. She was hypothermic at a stage I didn't know how to classify. Gray skin, darkened lips, that shaking that isn't really shaking anymore because the body doesn't have enough energy left to shiver properly, and settles into that thin, constant vibration. The bootless foot was wrapped in a layer of fabric that took me a second to recognize as her own shirt, wound around the outside of her sock. She had done that at some point during that night. She had thought of it. I asked what had happened. She spoke. The voice came out hoarse and fragmented, that loose string tone, but it came. She said she had slipped on the bank when the ice gave way, that she had gotten the entire right side of her soaked, that she had tried to get back but that there was something in the field that had kept her from finding her way. She said that last part with a vagueness I understood. There had been something in the field that had stopped her from getting back. She had circled, had lost her way, had ended up on that side of the river without quite knowing how. She had found the trunk and stayed there because continuing to move seemed to make things worse. I didn't ask about the jacket. I took mine off and put it over her, then did what you do. Held her shoulders, talked slowly, told her we were going back. She weighed almost nothing when I helped her to her feet, or at least that's how it felt, which sometimes is just adrenaline making the strength seem bigger than it is. The crossing back was harder with her alongside me. We went through the same stepping stones, but slowly, with the sky finally beginning to lighten for real on the eastern horizon. That low, thin orange that comes about 20 minutes before the sun, and that I had never been so glad to see. The water at her ankles made her pull in a sharp breath, but she didn't stop, kept walking. We crossed. We moved through the field toward the farm, and the lights in the house were all on now. My dad had woken up, had realized I'd gone out again, had turned everything on. I saw him appear in the back doorway before we'd reached the halfway point of the field. He came toward us in long strides without running. That way he has of controlled urgency. And when he got to us, he didn't say anything. Just put his arm on the other side of Deb and shared the weight. The three of us came in through the back door. My mom was already in the kitchen heating water. The search team arrived 40 minutes later and found Deb wrapped in a blanket in the kitchen chair drinking hot broth with hands that were still shaking, but with better color in her face. The paramedic who came with them said she had made it to the limit, but that she had made it. He said it like it was simple. Deb stayed at the farm 2 days before she was cleared to move. During those 2 days, we didn't talk about the argument that had started everything. We didn't talk about the night. She didn't ask what had happened in the field, and I didn't tell her. And that mutual omission had the specific weight of two people who understand that some things get smaller when you name them and bigger when you leave them where they are. On the second day, in the afternoon, she stood at the kitchen window for a while looking out at the north field with an expression I couldn't read. I didn't ask what she was seeing. She left the farm on the morning of the third day, with my mom driving her into town. I stood on the porch watching the car disappear down the road, and then stayed there a while longer, looking at the field that looked exactly the same as always during the day. Wide, white, ordinary, with the willows in the distance looking exactly like what they are in sunlight. The piece of jacket was still in my pocket. I hadn't told anyone. I still don't know if I will.